The crack of a gavel against wood silenced the rowdy crowd, gathered outside Seattle's only saloon on that scorching July afternoon in 1875. Grace Dunnley felt the rope around her wrists cut deeper as she was yanked forward onto the makeshift auction platform. Tears stained her dirt-smudged cheeks, but she refused to lower her gaze, even as the leering faces of miners, ranchers, and drifters assessed her worth like she was nothing more than livestock. $500 of debt, gentlemen, shouted Harold Pickering, the bank manager whose round belly strained against his expensive waistcoat. The late Mr. Dunnley's estate must be settled, and as per the territorial law, all his possessions, including his marriage contract, are forfeit to cover his obligations. Grace's shoulders trembled beneath her threadbare dress. Just 3 days ago, she'd been preparing dinner when they brought Thomas home, his body lifeless after a mining accident. Before she could even bury him properly, Pickering had arrived with papers showing Thomas had borrowed heavily against their small homestead. Now, at 24, she faced the unthinkable. "We'll start the bidding at $100, Pickering announced, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Who'll give me 100 for this fine woman? Young, healthy, can cook and clean and other wifely duties." His suggestive wink drew cruel laughter from the crowd. 100, called a grizzled miner whose breath reeked of whiskey even from 10 feet away. 120, countered a cattle driver with a scar running down his cheek. Grace fought back nausea as the bids climbed higher. The territorial laws were merciless. A woman had few rights, and a widow with debts had none. She scanned the faces, searching for a hint of compassion among the sea of callousness, but found none. 250, called a voice from the back, and the crowd parted to reveal Silas Lane standing tall, thumbs hooked casually in his belt. The afternoon sun glinted off his dark hair, and his piercing blue eyes never left Grace's face. Everyone knew Silas Lane. He'd arrived in Seattle 3 years prior, bought the struggling Double L Ranch outside town, and transformed it into one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. Unlike most men who'd struck it rich, Silas kept to himself, rarely visiting town except for supplies or occasional business at the bank. 275, countered the scarred cattle driver, eyeing Silas with suspicion. 300, said Silas, his voice calm but firm. Grace remembered seeing him occasionally at church or passing on the street, always polite but distant. Thomas had once done some carpentry work at his ranch, and had come home saying Silas Lane was a fair man, if a bit solitary. Now she clung to that assessment like a drowning person to driftwood. The bidding continued, climbing steadily as a few determined men vied for ownership of Grace. Her legs weakened as the amount approached $500, the total of Thomas's debt. 490, called the cattle driver, his face flushed with determination and drink. Pickering looked pleased, turning to Silas with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Lane, care to top that?" The crowd hushed as Silas stepped forward, the jingle of his spurs the only sound on the dusty street. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he stepped up to the platform and dropped it at Pickering's feet. The coins inside clinked heavily. "That debt's paid," Silas stated flatly. In full, Pickering fumbled with the pouch, counting quickly. $500 exactly, he confirmed, unable to hide his surprise. "The lady goes free," Silas said, drawing a knife from his belt. The crowd tensed, but he simply cut the ropes binding Grace's wrists. "This auction is over." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers as Pickering stamped the debt papers with his seal. "Paid in full," he declared reluctantly. Grace rubbed her raw wrists, stunned. "Mr. Lane," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't understand." "No decent man would stand for this," he replied quietly, his eyes still hard as he glared at the dispersing crowd. "I won't be claiming any ownership of you, Mrs. Dunnley. You're a free woman. But where will I go?" "They've taken everything. You'll have options," Silas assured her. "For now, my housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, could use help at the ranch. Paid work, your own room, for as long as you need to get on your feet." Hope fluttered in Grace's chest for the first time in days. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Silas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Because I've seen what happens when good people fall on hard times with no one to stand beside them." He offered his arm. "My wagon's down the street. Mrs. Jenkins will have dinner waiting." With one last look at the town that had been prepared to sell her to the highest bidder, Grace placed her trembling hand on Silas's arm and took her first step toward an uncertain future. The Double L Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of prime Washington Territory land, nestled against the foothills with a clear view of the distant mountains. As Silas's wagon crested the final hill, Grace gasped at the sight. A two-story main house built of solid timber stood proudly among several well-maintained outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Cattle grazed in the distance, and the evening sun bathed everything in golden light. "It's beautiful," she murmured, still clutching the small bundle of personal belongings Pickering had generously allowed her to take: her wedding band, a photograph of her parents, and a few articles of clothing. "Took 3 years to build it up," Silas replied, a hint of pride warming his typically reserved tone. "Was nothing but overgrazed land and a broken-down cabin when I arrived." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and before Silas could climb down, the front door swung open. A stout woman with silver-streaked hair and a kind face hurried down the steps, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "You're late for supper, Mr. Lane," she called before noticing Grace. Her expression immediately softened. "Oh, my dear, you must be Mrs. Dunnley." Grace shot a questioning glance at Silas, who was securing the horses. "I sent word ahead with one of the hands," he explained. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is Mrs. Grace Dunnley. She'll be staying with us for a time." "Well, thank heavens for that," Mrs. Jenkins said, already reaching for Grace's bundle. "I've made up the blue room for you, dear. Come along now, you look dead on your feet." Overwhelmed by the woman's immediate kindness, Grace followed her into the house. The interior was surprisingly warm and well-furnished, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. It wasn't ostentatious, but spoke of comfort and careful attention. "Mr. Lane told me about your situation," Mrs. Jenkins said quietly as she led Grace upstairs. "Disgraceful, what they tried to do. This territory needs more civilized laws for women, if you ask me." The blue room was a cozy chamber with a large bed, washstand, wardrobe, and a window overlooking the ranch's eastern pastures. Fresh wildflowers stood in a vase on the bedside table, their sweet scent filling the air. "Take your time settling in," Mrs. Jenkins said. "There's hot water for washing, and I've left a clean dress on the bed. It may be a bit large, but we can alter it tomorrow." After Mrs. Jenkins departed, Grace sank onto the bed, emotions finally overwhelming her. She wept silently for Thomas, for the humiliation she'd endured, and for the strange kindness of these strangers. When her tears subsided, she washed her face and changed into the offered dress, a simple blue cotton that hung loosely on her frame. Downstairs, she found Silas and Mrs. Jenkins in the dining room. A third place had been set at the table, laden with roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and freshly baked bread. "Please join us, Mrs. Dunnley," Silas said, standing as she entered. "You can call me Grace," she replied softly, taking the offered seat. Dinner conversation remained polite but restrained. Mrs. Jenkins spoke of ranch affairs, the vegetable garden's progress, and her ongoing battle with the raccoons raiding the henhouse. Silas responded with occasional comments or questions, his manner thoughtful and measured. Grace noted how the older woman and the rancher interacted with easy familiarity and mutual respect. As they finished eating, Silas finally addressed the situation directly. "Mrs. Jenkins will show you your duties tomorrow. There's plenty to be done, but nothing beyond your strength. You'll receive fair wages, your own room and meals. In return, I ask for honest work and respect for the ranch's rules." "What are those rules?" Grace asked. "Simple ones. No drinking on the property. No entertaining men in your quarters. Work starts at dawn and ends when it's done. Sundays for rest unless there's an emergency." His tone remained matter-of-fact. "You're free to leave any time you choose. This isn't a prison and you're not beholden to me or anyone else." Grace nodded, relief washing through her. "Thank you, Mr. Lane. I promise I won't be a burden." "Silas," he corrected quietly. "And you're not a burden, you're an employee. There's a difference." That night, lying in the most comfortable bed she'd slept in for years, Grace stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. She'd gone from wife to widow to nearly becoming property in the space of 3 days. Now she was an employee on a sprawling ranch, working for a man who'd spent $500 to free her, but wanted nothing in return except honest labor. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Thomas had been a kind husband, if not particularly successful. Their tiny homestead had never prospered despite his hard work, and now she understood why he'd been borrowing against their future, perhaps hoping for a lucky strike in the mines that never came. Grace pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Whatever Silas Lane's reasons for helping her, she would repay his kindness with diligence. Tomorrow would begin her new life not as a wife or a possession, but as her own woman earning her way. Dawn broke over the double L with the sound of roosters crowing and men calling to each other as they began the day's work. Grace, already dressed in her altered blue dress with an apron Mrs. Jenkins had provided, made her way downstairs to find the housekeeper kneading dough in the large kitchen. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Jenkins smiled. "You're an early riser. That'll serve you well here." "I've never been one to lie abed," Grace replied, rolling up her sleeves. "Please tell me how I can help." Over the next few hours, Grace learned the rhythm of the ranch house breakfast for Silas and the 8 ranch hands, cleaning, laundry, food preservation, and dozens of other daily tasks that kept the operation running smoothly. Mrs. Jenkins proved to be a patient teacher and delightful companion, her conversation sprinkled with stories of her 30 years in the territory. "Mr. Lane hired me 3 years ago when he first bought this land," she explained as they hung laundry on the line behind the house. "My Albert had just passed, and I was about to lose our place in town. The young man showed up at my door, said he'd heard I was the best cook in 3 counties and offered me this position." "That was fortunate timing," Grace remarked. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a knowing look. "Just like your situation. Mr. Lane has a habit of finding people at their lowest moments." Throughout that first day, Grace caught only glimpses of Silas, riding out with his men at dawn and returning briefly at midday for a quick meal before heading back to the far pastures. At dinner, he ate quickly, discussing cattle matters with his foreman before retreating to his study with account books. Days stretched into a week, then 2. Grace found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Her duties expanded as she proved her capabilities, taking over the vegetable garden, assisting with preserving the summer harvest, and eventually helping Mrs. Jenkins with the ranch's bookkeeping. Her interactions with Silas remained polite but limited. He was often gone before dawn and returned after sunset, the demands of running such a large operation keeping him constantly occupied. When they did share meals or pass in the hallway, he would inquire about her comfort or ask if she needed anything, but never pressed for personal conversation. One afternoon in early August, Grace was picking beans in the garden when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Silas rode in, his shirt dusty from the trail, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare. "Good afternoon," he called, dismounting with fluid grace. "I was hoping to find you here." Grace straightened, wiping her brow. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing at all. I just thought you might like some independence." He gestured to the mare. "This is Penny. She's even-tempered and patient with inexperienced riders." Grace approached cautiously, reaching out to stroke the horse's velvety nose. "She's beautiful, but I don't understand. The ranch is large, and you've been confined to the house and yard for weeks now," Silas explained. "I thought you might enjoy the freedom to ride out occasionally, see the land, visit the stream. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you used to enjoy riding before you were married." Surprised, Grace turned to him. "She told you that?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Mrs. Jenkins knows everyone's business. It's her special talent." "I haven't ridden in years," Grace admitted. "Thomas sold my mare to cover winter supplies our first year together. Penny will remember for both of you." Silas handed her the reins. "Would you like to try now? I could show you the western meadow the wildflowers are at their peak." The invitation was so unexpected that Grace found herself nodding before she'd fully considered it. "I'd like that very much. Let me just change my apron and tell Mrs. Jenkins." 20 minutes later, they rode side by side across the rolling grasslands of the Double L. Grace's initial nervousness quickly faded as Penny proved to be exactly as advertised, gentle and responsive. The afternoon sun warmed her face as they crested a hill, revealing a meadow awash in purple, yellow, and white wildflowers stretching to the tree line of a distant forest. "It's magnificent," Grace breathed, reining Penny to a stop beside Silas's stallion. "This is my favorite spot on the ranch," Silas admitted, his usual reserve softening as he surveyed the landscape. "Especially this time of year." They dismounted, letting the horses graze while they walked among the flowers. Grace found herself relaxing in Silas's company for the first time, asking questions about the ranch's operations and his plans for expansion. "You know a great deal about ranching for someone who's only been here a month," he observed as they sat on a fallen log at the meadow's edge. Grace smiled. "I grew up on a small cattle operation in Missouri. My father taught me everything he knew, expecting me to marry a rancher and put that knowledge to use." Her smile faded. "Instead, I fell in love with Thomas, a carpenter with dreams of striking it rich in the goldfields." "You loved him very much," Silas said quietly. "I did. He was kind and full of dreams, even if those dreams never quite materialized." She twisted her wedding band still on her finger. "He wasn't a perfect man, but he didn't deserve to die in that mine." Silas was silent for a moment. "Few of us get what we deserve in this life, good or bad. All we can do is make the best choices with what we're given." "Like you did, coming to my aid that day?" Grace asked, finally voicing the question that had lingered since her arrival. "Why did you really do it, Silas? $500 is no small sum to spend on a stranger." His blue eyes met hers directly. "I couldn't stand by and watch a decent woman being sold like property, not when I had the means to prevent it. There must be more to it than that." Silas looked away, his gaze traveling across the sun-dappled meadow. "My mother found herself in a similar situation when I was 10. My father died unexpectedly, leaving substantial debts. In Pennsylvania, they couldn't auction her, but they took everything else: our home, our belongings, even my father's tools that I might have used to earn a living. What happened to her? To you, we survived. Barely. She took work as a laundress, living in a room hardly bigger than a closet. I did odd jobs, stole when I had to. His voice remained steady, but Grace saw the tension in his jaw. She died when I was 16, worn out from work and worry. I'm so sorry, Grace whispered. I made a promise at her grave that I'd never stand by when someone was being crushed by circumstances beyond their control. He turned back to her. When I saw you on that auction block, I saw my mother's face. That's all there was to it. In that moment, Grace understood Silas Lane better than she had in all the weeks at his ranch. Behind his reserved manner was a man shaped by hardship, driven by principles forged in suffering. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. As they approached the barn, Silas spoke again. "Penny is yours, by the way, not a loan." "Silas, I can't accept. Consider it part of your wages. Every ranch hand needs a good horse." Grace couldn't argue with that logic, though she suspected the mare was worth considerably more than what he'd paid her so far. "Thank you," she said simply. That evening at supper, Mrs. Jenkins noticed the change immediately: the easier conversation, the occasional shared glances between them. She hid her smile behind her napkin and began plotting how to ensure these two wounded souls had more opportunities to discover each other. As summer gave way to early autumn, Grace found herself increasingly involved in the ranch's operations. Her knowledge of cattle, dormant since her girlhood, proved valuable during the fall roundup. Silas began consulting her on decisions, respecting her insights and experience. Their rides together became a regular occurrence, sometimes with a purpose, checking fence lines or inspecting grazing areas, but often simply for pleasure. During these times, their conversations deepened. Grace learned about Silas's journey west, his years working on ranches across the territories, before saving enough to purchase the Double L. He, in turn, heard about her childhood in Missouri, her dreams of education that had never materialized, and her complicated grief over Thomas. "I feel guilty sometimes," she confessed one crisp October afternoon as they rode along the creek that marked the ranch's northern boundary. "Not just for moving forward after Thomas's death, but for realizing our marriage wasn't what I'd hoped it would be." "Grief isn't simple," Silas replied. "Especially when the person we're mourning was complex. He kept so many secrets. The debts, the failed investments. Sometimes I wonder if I ever truly knew him." She pulled Penny to a stop, looking out over the water. "Is it wrong that I feel more at home here after just 3 months than I ever did in the 6 years I was married to Thomas?" Silas dismounted and approached her horse, offering his hand to help her down. "Finding peace isn't a betrayal, Grace. It's survival." Standing beside the creek, with autumn leaves drifting down around them, Grace felt something shift between them, a barrier lowering, a possibility emerging. Silas stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the small scar near his left eyebrow. "Grace," he said softly, "I want you to know that your position here is secure regardless of anything else that might develop between us." Her heart quickened. "What might develop between us, Silas?" Instead of answering with words, he slowly reached for her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles. The simple gesture held more tenderness than any words could express. "I've grown very fond of you," he said finally. "More than is appropriate for an employer. If that makes you uncomfortable, I'll never mention it again." Grace surprised herself by stepping closer. "And if it doesn't make me uncomfortable, Then I'd very much like to court you properly, when you're ready. A smile spread across her face. I think I'd like that too. Their return to the ranch was marked by a new awareness between them, small glances and hidden smiles that didn't escape Mrs. Jenkins's notice. That evening, as Grace helped clear the supper dishes, the older woman nudged her gently. "About time," she murmured. "I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the root cellar to make any progress." "Mrs. Jenkins!" Grace exclaimed, blushing furiously. "Oh, don't Mrs. Jenkins me, girl. I've watched you two dance around each other for months. He lights up when you enter a room, though he thinks he hides it well. Does everyone know?" "Only those with eyes in their heads," the housekeeper chuckled. "But don't worry, the hands are too busy with the fall roundup to gossip about the boss's love life." "It's not. We haven't." Grace fumbled for words. "Give it time." Mrs. Jenkins patted her hand. "Some things are worth waiting for." The following weeks brought a gradual evolution in Silas and Grace's relationship. He began joining her for evening walks around the ranch, their conversations ranging from practical matters like cattle breeding to philosophical discussions about books they'd both read. One Sunday, he drove her into town for church services, making their association public for the first time. The reactions were mixed. Some townspeople welcomed Grace warmly, expressing relief at her improved circumstances. Others whispered behind fans and hats, speculating about her relationship with the wealthy rancher. Most painful were the encounters with those who had been present at the auction, their eyes either sliding away in shame or lingering with resentment that she had escaped their bidding. "Ignore them," Silas murmured as they exited the church, his hand supportive at her elbow. "Their opinions don't matter." "Easy for you to say," Grace replied, forcing a smile as they passed the bank manager, Pickering, who offered a stiff nod. "You weren't the one on display like a prize heifer." "No, but I was the one who ruined their entertainment," Silas countered with unexpected humor. "I suspect I'm quite unpopular among certain elements for that." The comment startled a genuine laugh from Grace, drawing more curious glances. "Then we're outcasts together." "I can think of worse fates," he said, helping her into the buggy. As they drove back to the ranch, Grace felt a weight lifting. The town that had humiliated her no longer held power over her happiness or future. Her life was at the Double L now with Silas Mrs. Jenkins and the community they'd formed. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Silas reached for her hand. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her despite the autumn chill. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Yes." Grace turned to him, noting the unusual tension in his expression. "Would you consider removing your wedding band?" "Not because I don't respect your past," he added quickly, "but because I hope you're considering a future where you might wear a different ring." The directness of his question took her breath away. Grace looked down at the simple gold band that had adorned her finger for 6 years. It represented a chapter of her life not all happy but significant nonetheless. "I've been thinking about that myself," she admitted. "It's been nearly 4 months since Thomas died. I'm not sure what's proper." "Proper be damned," Silas said with sudden intensity. "What do you want, Grace?" The question, so simple yet so profound, made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. How long had it been since anyone had asked what she wanted? Thomas had made decisions for them both. Before him, her father had directed her life. Even Silas, for all his kindness, had initially offered her a position and path without much consultation. "I want to move forward," she said finally. "I'll always honor Thomas's memory, but I don't want to be defined by being his widow for the rest of my life." With trembling fingers, she slipped the gold band from her finger. The pale indentation left behind felt strange, vulnerable. "I don't know if I'm ready for another ring just yet," she continued, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I am ready to see where this path between us leads." Silas's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "That's all I could ask for." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. It was enough to change everything. As winter descended on the Washington Territory, the Double L settled into its cold weather routines. Cattle were moved to sheltered pastures. Supplies were stockpiled against potential snowstorms, and the ranch house became a haven of warmth and light against the early darkness. Grace's role continued to evolve. No longer simply Mrs. Jenkins's assistant, she had taken over much of the ranch's bookkeeping and correspondence, revealing a sharp mind for business that Silas increasingly relied upon. Their courtship progressed with the steady, unhurried pace that characterized Silas himself, evening chess games by the fire, reading aloud from shared books, long conversations about their hopes and fears. 2 weeks before Christmas, a fierce snowstorm blanketed the region. For 3 days, the ranch was isolated by drifts too deep for travel. On the fourth morning, Grace awoke to find the world transformed into a crystalline wonderland, sunlight glinting off snow-laden branches and ice-encrusted fences. After breakfast, Silas surprised her by appearing at the kitchen door with 2 pairs of snowshoes. "Care to see something spectacular?" he asked, eyes twinkling with rare mischief. Bundled in warm coats, scarves, and gloves, they set out across the pristine landscape. The snowshoes made movement possible, if somewhat awkward, and Grace found herself laughing as she struggled to maintain her balance. Silas stayed close, catching her arm whenever she wobbled. "Where are we going?" she asked as they crossed the meadow that had been filled with wildflowers during her first ride with him. "You'll see," was his only answer, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. After nearly an hour of steady progress, they reached a small rise overlooking a frozen pond Grace had never seen before. The surface gleamed like polished silver in the winter sunshine, surrounded by snow-covered pines. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, her words forming clouds in the cold air. "My secret spot," Silas admitted. "I found it my first winter here. Somehow, no matter how harsh the season, it always feels peaceful here." He guided her down to the pond's edge, where a fallen log had been cleared of snow. From his coat, he produced a small flask of hot coffee and 2 tin cups, pouring the steaming liquid with careful precision. As they sipped the warming brew, Grace studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, now bearing a neatly trimmed beard for winter, the straight nose, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. In the past months, she'd come to know this man's character, his integrity, his quiet strength, his occasional flashes of dry humor. "Penny for your thoughts?" Silas asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking how different my life is now from what I expected," Grace replied honestly. "If someone had told me on the day of that auction that I'd be sitting here with you like this, I would never have believed them. Regrets? Not a single one." She reached for his gloved hand. "Thomas and I had our moments of happiness, but I never felt truly seen by him. With you, I feel like every part of me matters, my thoughts, my experiences, my dreams." Silas set down his cup, turning to face her fully. "I've been wanting to say something to you for weeks now, but I've been waiting for the right moment." He drew a deep breath. "I think this is it." Grace's heart quickened as he took both her hands in his. "I love you, Grace. Not just for your beauty or your kindness, though both take my breath away. I love your strength, your resilience, your quick mind. I love how you hum when you think no one's listening and how fiercely you defend your opinions during our chess games." His voice deepened with emotion. "I want to build a life with you not as my employee or even just as my wife, but as my true partner in everything." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, freezing on her lashes in the cold air. "Silas." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I'm not asking you to answer right away. I know we've only known each other a short time and your heart is still healing. But I wanted you to know my intentions." He opened the box to reveal a ring with a single perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's, the only thing of value I managed to keep when everything else was taken." Grace stared at the ring, understanding the profound significance of this offering. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like you," he replied simply. "When you're ready, whether that's today or months from now, it's yours." In that moment, looking into his earnest blue eyes, Grace realized the answer had been forming in her heart for weeks. The grief for Thomas had transformed from a sharp pain to a gentle acknowledgement of what had been. In its place had grown something new and stronger, a love based not on youthful dreams or desperation, but on mutual respect and genuine understanding. "I don't need more time," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I love you, Silas Lane. I want nothing more than to be your wife and partner." His face transformed with joy as he removed his gloves to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her all along. His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a passion that sent warmth coursing through her despite the winter chill. When they finally parted, both breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "You've made me the happiest man in the territory. When shall we marry?" Grace asked, admiring how the pearl caught the winter sunlight. "As soon as the road's clear enough for the minister to reach us," Silas replied. "Unless you want a grand affair in town," Grace shook her head. "I'd rather have a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded only by those who truly care for us." The journey back to the ranch seemed to fly by, their happiness warming them against the cold. As they approached the house, Mrs. Jenkins appeared on the porch, her expression anxious until she caught sight of their joined hands and radiant faces. "Well," she called, hands on hips. Silas laughed, the sound ringing across the snow-covered yard. "She said yes, Mrs. Jenkins's whoop of delight brought several ranch hands running from the barn, confusion turning to grins as the news spread. By supper time, the entire Double L was celebrating the engagement, the bunkhouse contributing its hidden stores of whiskey for impromptu toasts. 2 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Grace Dunnley became Grace Lane in a ceremony performed in the ranch house parlor, decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for the holiday. The minister from Seattle had made the journey despite the challenging roads, and Mrs. Jenkins had outdone herself preparing a feast for the ranch hands and the few friends close enough to attend. Grace wore a new dress of deep blue velvet, ordered specially from Seattle. As Silas placed a gold band alongside her pearl engagement ring, his hands were steady, but his voice trembled slightly with emotion. The minister pronounced them husband and wife just as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 6, and their kiss was met with cheers and applause from their small gathering of witnesses. The celebration continued well into the night, with music provided by 2 ranch hands who proved surprisingly talented on fiddle and harmonica. Silas revealed an unexpected ability to dance, whirling Grace around the cleared parlor with confidence and grace. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless from a particularly energetic reel. "My mother insisted I learn properly," he answered, his hand warm at her waist. She said a gentleman should know how to dance even if he never attends a ball. She would be proud of the man you've become, Grace said softly. His eyes darkened with emotion. I hope so. I think she would have loved you. As midnight approached, they slipped away from the festivities to the privacy of the master bedroom, now their shared room. Silas had spent weeks having it refurbished for Grace's comfort, adding a new dressing table, softer bedding, and curtains in her favorite shade of blue. Their first night together as husband and wife was a discovery of tenderness and passion neither had fully anticipated. In Silas's arms, Grace found a completeness she had never known, their bodies and hearts joining in perfect harmony. As they lay entwined afterward, listening to the distant sounds of celebration continuing downstairs, Silas traced gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you happy, Mrs. Lane?" He murmured against her hair. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Though I still can't quite believe how my life has changed in just 6 months, from that auction block to this." Silas's arms tightened around her. "That day, when I said that debt's paid, I had no idea I was the one being given a gift beyond price." "We saved each other," Grace replied, resting her head on his chest, listening to the strong, steady beating of his heart. "And that's the most precious gift of all." Spring came early to the Washington Territory in 1876. By March, the snow had retreated to the distant mountain peaks, and the Double L Ranch was bustling with activity. New calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the greening pastures, and the vegetable garden Grace had expanded was showing its first tender shoots. Life, as Silas Lane's wife, had settled into a rhythm that brought Grace deep contentment. Their partnership extended to every aspect of ranch operations, Silas respecting her intelligence and experience, Grace supporting his vision for the Double Elticas future. Together, they made decisions about breeding stock, land purchases, and investments that would secure their prosperity for years to come. Their personal happiness grew alongside the ranch's success. Mornings began with shared coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over their domain. Evenings ended in the intimacy of their bedroom, where they continued to discover new depths to their passion for each other. Even their occasional disagreements, inevitable between two strong-minded individuals, were resolved with mutual respect and understanding. On a particularly fine April morning, Grace sat at her desk in the small office she and Silas now shared, reviewing cattle sale contracts. The window was open, allowing the scent of blooming wildflowers to drift in on the breeze. She paused, suddenly overcome by a wave of nausea that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Mrs. Jenkins, passing the open door with a basket of linens, stopped and observed her pale face. "Still feeling peakish, are we?" Grace nodded, taking a deep breath as the sensation passed. "It comes and goes, mostly in the mornings." The housekeeper set down her basket and closed the office door. "Have you told him yet?" "Told him what?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what Mrs. Jenkins was implying. "That he's going to be a father by Christmas," the older woman stated matter-of-factly. "I've raised 4 children of my own and helped bring dozens more into this world. I know the signs." A mixture of hope and fear fluttered in Grace's chest. She had begun to suspect the same thing but had been hesitant to voice it until she was certain. "Do you really think so?" "I'd stake my reputation on it," Mrs. Jenkins replied with a confident nod. "The queasiness, the way you've been avoiding coffee, how you nearly fell asleep at the supper table last night. Classic signs, everyone." Grace rested her hand on her still flat abdomen, trying to imagine the tiny life that might be growing within. "I wanted to be sure before I told Silas." "Men are strange creatures about such things," Mrs. Jenkins said with a knowing smile. They faced down stampeding cattle without blinking but turned pale at the prospect of diapers and midnight feedings. Still, I've never seen a man more ready to be a father than that husband of yours. After Mrs. Jenkins departed, Grace sat quietly, contemplating how to share this momentous news with Silas. The possibility of a child filled her with joy tempered by natural anxiety. Her own mother had died in childbirth when Grace was just 8 years old, leaving her with only vague memories of maternal affection. She was still lost in thought when Silas returned from his morning rounds, his boots leaving muddy prints on the office floor as he strode in. "The north pasture is looking better than expected," he announced, then paused, noticing her distracted expression. "Grace, is everything all right?" She looked up at her husband, this man who had rescued her from unthinkable degradation, who had given her not just security but love and partnership. In that moment, her anxiety melted away, replaced by certainty that together they could face any challenge. "Everything's wonderful," she said, rising to meet him. "But I have something important to tell you." Concern crossed his features. "What is it?" Taking his hands in hers, Grace met his eyes directly. "I believe I'm with child, Silas. We're going to have a baby around Christmas time." His expression transformed from concern to astonishment to incandescent joy in the span of heartbeats. "A baby," he whispered, as though saying it too loudly might make the miracle disappear. "Are you certain?" "Mrs. Jenkins seems to think so," Grace replied with a smile. "And my own body is giving me similar signs." Silas dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face gently against her midsection. "A child," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." Grace ran her fingers through his hair, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "Are you pleased?" He looked up, his blue eyes shining. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe what I'm feeling. Overwhelmed, terrified, ecstatic." He stood and gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance. "We're going to be parents, Grace." His joy was infectious, banishing the last of her worries. As he set her down carefully, already treating her as though she were made of glass, Grace laughed. "I'm not ill, Silas. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Yes, but none of those women were carrying my child," he replied, his protective instincts clearly awakened. "From now on, no more heavy lifting. No riding unless absolutely necessary, and I'm having Doc Miller come out from town to examine you properly." Grace placed her hands on his chest. "I will be sensible, I promise, but I won't be wrapped in cotton wool for the next 7 months either. This ranch needs both of us." Silas covered her hands with his own. "The ranch can manage. You and our child are what matter most." The following months brought changes to the Double L. News of the coming baby spread quickly, with the ranch hands taking an almost proprietary interest in Little Lane, as they referred to the unborn child. Mrs. Jenkins began knitting tiny garments, while Silas threw himself into preparing a nursery adjacent to their bedroom, crafting a cradle from cherry wood with his own hands. By autumn, Grace's condition was unmistakable, her slender frame now supporting a prominent belly. Despite Silas's protective hovering, she remained involved in ranch operations, though she had conceded to conducting more business from her desk rather than on horseback. One crisp November afternoon, as golden leaves drifted from the cottonwoods along the creek, Grace sat on the porch swing Silas had installed that summer, her hands resting on her swollen abdomen. The baby was particularly active, kicking and rolling as though eager to explore the world. "Settle down in there," she murmured affectionately. "You've got another month before your grand entrance." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Silas rode in, accompanied by 2 unfamiliar men. Grace watched curiously as they dismounted and engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation near the corral. When Silas finally approached the house, his expression was troubled. "What is it?" Grace asked as he joined her on the porch. "Those men are from the Territorial Land Office," he explained, sitting beside her on the swing. "There's been a complication with some of our property." Grace frowned. "What kind of complication?" Silas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as a sign of frustration. "It seems the western section, about 80 acres including the wildflower meadow, may have been improperly registered when I purchased it. There's another claim on the land." "After 3 years. How is that possible?" "The claimant has been away serving in the Army. He returned recently and filed a petition based on a homesteading claim his father initiated before I bought the property." Silas's jaw tightened. "The land office is reviewing the documentation, but there's a possibility we could lose that section." Grace placed her hand over his. "Is it critical to our operations?" "Not critical, no. We could manage without it." He interlaced his fingers with hers. "But it's more than just Pasture Ellen to me. It's where we first began to know each other. Where I proposed." "Our meadow," Grace said softly, understanding his attachment. "The men suggested I could buy out the other claim, but the claimant is being difficult, asking an exorbitant price." "How exorbitant?" Silas named a figure that made Grace gasp. "That's nearly what you paid for the entire ranch." "Precisely." His expression darkened. "I think he knows exactly what he's doing. His name is James Pickering." "Pickering? Any relation to the bank manager?" "His son," Silas confirmed grimly. "I suspect this is less about the land and more about settling a score." Understanding dawned on Grace. "Because you interfered with the auction. You embarrassed his father publicly." "So it would seem." Grace felt the baby kick vigorously as though sensing the tension. She rubbed her belly soothingly while considering the situation. "What will you do?" "What can I do? I won't be extorted." Silas's voice was firm. "If the land office rules in Pickering's favor, we'll lose that section. It's unfortunate but not devastating. Couldn't we contest it? Hire a lawyer from Seattle?" "I've considered that. But legal battles can drag on for years, costing more than the land is worth." He squeezed her hand. "I don't want this cloud hanging over us when the baby comes. Some things are more important than property." Grace nodded, acknowledging his wisdom while feeling a deep sadness at the potential loss of their special place. "You're right, of course. We still have everything that truly matters." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Grace watched Silas move about the room with unusual quietness. The land dispute had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. "Come to bed," she said softly, patting the space beside her. "You look exhausted." He complied, extinguishing the lamp before sliding under the quilts. In the darkness, he drew her into his arms, her back against his chest, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. "I'm sorry about the meadow," he murmured against her hair. "Don't apologize. You didn't cause this situation." Grace covered his hand with hers. "Besides, the memories aren't in the land itself, but in our hearts. No one can take those from us." She felt him smile against her shoulder. "How did I get so fortunate to find a wife with both beauty and wisdom?" "You paid a debt," she replied simply, "and received blessings in return." The land office's decision came 3 weeks later. The western section would indeed revert to James Pickering's ownership unless Silas agreed to pay the demanded price. True to his word, Silas declined, accepting the loss with outward stoicism while Grace knew he grieved privately. Nature, however, had other plans. 2 days after the decision, Grace awoke in the pre-dawn hours to a sharp pain radiating across her abdomen. As she shifted uncomfortably, she felt a rush of warm fluid soaking the bedsheets. "Silas," she gasped, shaking his shoulder. "The baby's coming." He was instantly alert, striking a match to light the bedside lamp. "But it's too early," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Only by a few weeks," Grace reassured him, though another contraction was already building. "Babies come when they're ready, not according to our schedules." The next hours passed in a blur of pain, fear, and determination. Mrs. Jenkins took charge, sending a ranch hand galloping toward town to fetch the doctor while she prepared the bedroom for delivery. Silas refused to leave Grace's side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow and whispering words of encouragement. By mid-morning, the contractions were coming fast and strong, but the doctor had still not arrived. A winter storm was brewing, turning the road from town treacherous. "The baby isn't waiting for Dr. Miller," Mrs. Jenkins announced after checking Grace's progress. "I've delivered plenty of babies in my time. We'll manage." Grace nodded, too focused on the overwhelming sensations of her body to speak. Silas looked terrified but remained steady, his grip on her hand unwavering. "You can do this, my love," he murmured. "You're the strongest person I know." The final stage of labor was intense beyond anything Grace had imagined. As she pushed with all her strength, the world narrowed to Silas's voice, Mrs. Jenkins's calm instructions, and the primal drive to bring their child into the world. With a final, tremendous effort, Grace felt the baby slip free, followed immediately by the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, a lusty, indignant cry announcing the new arrival's presence. "It's a boy," Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean towel. "A fine, strong boy." Tears streamed down Silas's face as he looked from the baby to Grace with wonder. "We have a son," he whispered, his voice breaking. Mrs. Jenkins placed the swaddled infant on Grace's chest. Through exhausted tears, Grace beheld her son's tiny, perfect face, a miniature blend of herself and Silas, with a shock of dark hair and a determined little chin. "Hello, Samuel," she said softly, the name they had chosen for a boy coming naturally to her lips. Silas placed his hand gently on the baby's head. "Samuel Thomas Lane," he added, honoring Grace's first husband in a gesture that filled her heart with gratitude. The new family had precious little time together before Mrs. Jenkins shooed Silas away so she could attend to Grace's post-delivery needs. By the time he was permitted to return, Grace was clean and comfortable, propped against pillows with Samuel nursing contentedly at her breast. "He's perfect," Silas said, sitting carefully beside them on the bed. "Like his mother." Grace smiled tiredly. "He has your determined expression already. I suspect he'll be as stubborn as his father." A knock at the bedroom door interrupted their peaceful moment. One of the ranch hands stood there, looking uncomfortable about intruding but clearly bearing news he deemed important. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Lane, but there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent business about the western property." Silas frowned. "Tell whoever it is that I'm occupied with family matters. It can wait until tomorrow." "It's young Mr. Pickering himself, sir, and he's not alone. There's an older gentleman with him, looks important." Silas exchanged a glance with Grace, who nodded. "It's all right. Samuel and I need to rest anyway." With obvious reluctance, Silas left the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. Grace dozed while Samuel slept against her chest, the warmth of his tiny body and the rhythm of his breathing lulling her into exhausted slumber. She woke to the sound of the bedroom door opening, expecting to see Mrs. Jenkins checking on them. Instead, Silas entered, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and joy. Behind him came two men, one a well-dressed younger man with an unpleasant, pinched face that Grace recognized as James Pickering, the other an elderly gentleman in an expensive coat, leaning on a silver-headed cane. "Grace," Silas said softly, "this is Judge William Carver from the Territorial Supreme Court, and you know of Mr. Pickering." Grace instinctively held Samuel closer, confused by this intrusion into their private moment. The elderly judge stepped forward, his keen eyes taking in the mother and newborn. "Mrs. Lane, I apologize for disturbing you at such a time. I wouldn't have insisted if the matter weren't urgent." "What matter?" Grace asked, looking to Silas for explanation. It was the judge who answered. "The disputed land claim, madam. I've reviewed the case personally and made some interesting discoveries." He turned a stern gaze on the younger Pickering, who shifted uncomfortably. "It seems certain documents submitted to the land office were altered, dates changed, signatures modified." "Forgeries?" Grace asked sharply. "Precisely." Judge Carver nodded. "Mr. Pickering has admitted his role in the deception, once confronted with the evidence." James Pickering stared at the floor, his face flushed with anger or shame, perhaps both. "The land office's decision has been reversed," the judge continued. "The western section rightfully belongs to the Double L Ranch, as it has since your husband purchased it 3 years ago." Relief washed over Grace. "Our meadow," she whispered to Silas, who nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "Furthermore," Judge Carver added, his tone growing severe, "I've initiated an investigation into Harold Pickering's banking practices. The auction of Mrs. Lane last summer has raised serious questions about his interpretation and application of territorial law." James Pickering finally spoke, his voice bitter. "My father had every right. Your father had no right to sell a human being regardless of her husband's debts," the judge interrupted sharply. "Such practices may have been tolerated in this territory due to isolation and frontier justice, but they will not stand under proper legal scrutiny. The territorial legislature is already drafting amendments to prevent similar occurrences." Grace looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the momentous changes his birthday had brought. "Thank you, Judge Carver," she said simply. The judge bowed slightly. "Don't thank me, Mrs. Lane, thank your husband. It was his reputation for integrity that brought this matter to my attention in the first place." He turned to Silas. "Your standing in this community carries weight, Mr. Lane. There are those who listen when you speak." After the visitors departed, Silas returned to Grace's side, gathering her and Samuel in a gentle embrace. "Is it really over?" Grace asked, still processing the unexpected turn of events. "It's over," Silas confirmed. "The meadow is ours. And more importantly, Pickering and men like him have been put on notice. What happened to you won't happen to other women in this territory." Grace smiled down at their son. "He's not even a day old, and already he's brought justice with him." "Samuel the righteous," Silas chuckled. "A fitting legacy for our son." The winter of 1876 passed in the blur of new parenthood sleepless nights, the miracle of tiny fingers and toes, the indescribable joy of watching Samuel grow stronger each day. By spring, he was a chubby, cheerful baby with Silas's blue eyes and Grace's gentle smile. On a perfect June afternoon, exactly 1 year after Silas had first shown her the wildflower meadow, Grace rode Penny alongside her husband. Samuel securely cradled in a special carrier Silas had designed for horseback travel. The meadow was as beautiful as she remembered, perhaps more so for having nearly been lost to them. Wildflowers carpeted the rolling land in a riot of color: purple lupine, golden balsam root, scarlet Indian paintbrush, and dozens of varieties Grace couldn't name. They dismounted near the fallen log where Silas had proposed, spreading a blanket in the lush grass. Samuel was immediately fascinated by the dancing flowers and buzzing insects, his little hands reaching out to grab at everything within reach. "He's going to be walking before we know it," Grace observed, watching him rock determinedly on hands and knees. "Nothing will be safe." "The double L will be his playground," Silas replied, pride evident in his voice. "And someday his legacy." Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment warming her more thoroughly than the June sunshine. "When I was standing on that auction block a year ago, I thought my life was over. I could never have imagined this." Silas's arm tightened around her waist. "When I said that debt's paid, I had no idea I was beginning the most important journey of my life." "Our life," Grace corrected, turning to kiss him softly. "Our life," he agreed. As Samuel crawled happily among the wildflowers, occasionally holding one up for their inspection with delighted giggles, Grace reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought her here. From the depths of despair to heights of joy she had never thought possible, her journey had been one of unexpected redemption. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Grace smiled, watching their son discover the world with boundless curiosity and joy. "That some debts, once paid, return blessings 100-fold. Silas nodded, understanding perfectly as he always did. "And those are the debts most worth paying." Together, they sat in the meadow that had almost been lost to them, surrounded by wildflowers and the laughter of their son, planning their future and counting their blessings, both those they already enjoyed and those still to come in the years ahead. For Grace Lane, formerly Grace Dunnley, the auction block was a distant memory, overshadowed by the reality of a life filled with love, purpose, and the sweet knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged.